really thrilled that you all could join us this afternoon to learn more about local context, an organization that the State Archives is really thrilled to work with, and really very pleased that we can share their excellent work and opportunities with all of you as well. I'd like to start off the program today with a land acknowledgement statement that the Maine State Archives includes in all of our programs and board meetings. So I'll begin with that. The Maine State Archives is located on the land of the Wabanaki, the people of the Dawn. We recognize and honor the Abenaki, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Maliseet, and Micmac nations and all Native communities of the past, present, and future in the land that is now called Maine. As keepers of the many treaties and agreements that led to colonization of this land, the staff of the Maine State Archives acknowledge our important role to work closely with Native peoples to share and preserve all history. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. And with that, I want to get the program started. As I've mentioned, for those of you who are just joining us, we are recording so that we can share this program with anyone who wasn't able to attend. If you would like a copy of the recording too, just let me know. This program is offered by the Maine Historic Records Advisory Board. It's a wonderful advisory board connected with the Maine State Archives and the Maine Historical Society. The board just underwent their a really wonderful strategic planning process, and their new strategic plan is available on their page of the Maine State Archives website. So I encourage you to check it out. They're hoping to do a lot more of programs like this and sharing opportunities with collecting institutions in Maine. And that work of the strategic planning process and being able to offer programs like this is supported by the National Historic Publications and Records Commission, which is part of the Federal National Archives. And so with that, we thank you all, and I want to hand it over to Corey. Corey's with us from Local Context. As I said, we are pleased to partner with them. Maine State Archives is actually the first state archives to partner with Local Context. We're like super thrilled about that, and hoping to spread the word and get more involvement. So Corey, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I will start sharing my screen, but maybe James, do you mind starting with just an introduction of yourself while I'm doing that?
Yeah, good afternoon, folks. Thank you all for coming. My name is James Eric Francis Sr. I am the council chair for Local Context. I also serve as the chair for the Maine State Archives Board. So this is a collaboration that at least makes sense to me. My day job, I am the Director of Cultural and Historic Preservation for the Penobscot Nation. And so I've been doing this work with Local Context for about just under a decade. And I find it exciting that the state of Maine, through the archives, has stepped up to the plate and started this this journey with the Indigenous people of Maine. So thank you all for coming. Take it away, Corey.
Thanks, James. And just to introduce myself, I am not Jane Anderson. Jane couldn't join us today and sends apologies, but my name is Corey Rowe. I'm the Director of Outreach and Strategy with Local Context. And just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm a settler. I'm based on Paugussett and Wappinger lands in what is today known as Connecticut. I've been with Local Context for a little bit over 2 years now, and my background is in museum studies. So we appreciate your land acknowledgement statement, but we always like to do one ourselves as well. We are an organization, as you're going to hear today. We're based across multiple countries, and so we do have this land acknowledgement. And we always wish to recognize the ongoing significance of the lands that we work on to the Indigenous peoples of those lands. Our work is really focused on addressing the ongoing legacy of settler colonialism, as well as supporting a different future. So like the Maine State Archives, we are doing our own land acknowledgement to disrupt settler colonialism and recognize whose lands we're on, as well as our responsibilities as guests here. So just to give you an overview of what we're planning for today, I'm going to start off with a little bit of background about local context. Then we'll move into the traditional knowledge and biocultural labels. We'll talk about the notices and then have time for questions. So just to start with local context began in 2010, and it really began as an intervention to bring Indigenous cultural authority and data sovereignty back into cultural heritage spaces. The traditional knowledge labels, which we'll talk about today, those were created through iteration and partnership with Indigenous communities around the world as a tool for that intervention. So these were then followed by the notices for institutions and researchers, and most recently, the biocultural labels. The organization really started as a research project based out of universities in the US and Aotearoa, New Zealand, but we have just recently become our own 501c3 nonprofit organization registered in the Navajo Nation, which we're very excited about. So just to talk a little bit about our team, what we do. So we are still based across 2 continents, 2 countries. So most of our meetings are still looking like a Zoom meeting, but we do occasionally get to see each other in person. Our team is also pretty multifaceted. We have like multiple arms that are focused on like the design and development of our tools, the outreach to support their use, as well as scholarship in Indigenous data sovereignty and related fields. So just to give you an idea of the widespread interest and application in local contexts, this is a map showing our global connections. So this is communities, institutions, and researchers who are interested or already using local contexts. You can see it's pretty heavy in North America and Oceania. Again, this is where our team has been based so far. We have also largely been working in English so far, but we are expanding to other geographical areas as well as other languages. So expect this map to continue to grow. I also just wanted to pause and talk about our terminology that we'll be using a little bit today. So when we're talking about communities, we're talking about First Nations, nations, tribes, bands, confederations, land councils, and similar collective sovereign Indigenous groups. And so this might be represented by entities like tribal historic preservation offices or TIPOs, cultural centers, language departments, land councils, tribal archives, libraries, museums, and colleges. Institutions, we are referring to organizations that are stewarding or collecting Indigenous data or collections. There's, of course, Indigenous institutions, but we're always going to specify. And the institutions that we are in touch with and working with range in the GLAM fields. It's really from natural history to sound to history to art. Also includes research institutions and labs, as well as libraries, colleges, and universities as well. Researchers, we're talking about individuals who are conducting research or generating data. Again, this runs from linguists to biodiversity scientists to historians and law scholars. And we're using these categories knowing there are many individuals who occupy multiple roles and affiliations, of course. And our organization really strives to recognize the many hats that people wear, particularly Indigenous people working in these spaces. But just to talk a little bit about some of the core ideas that prompted local context. So these are some contemporary challenges for Indigenous people in data and information systems. So as you will know, Indigenous data and collections are held by institutions around the world. Those belongings can often be thousands of miles from their community. And because of the colonial and imperial legacy of how the materials were collected, significant information can be missing. So community names might be excluded, might have been not considered important, or might have been wrong. And this misinformation, this misattribution continues to affect how communities today can find the information and reassert their control. Further, because of the way that intellectual property operates, which is out of really a settler-based interest, communities are largely not the legal rights holder of their materials. So again, this is leading to a lack of control and governance. And so this lack of governance goes against Indigenous people's rights of sovereignty. This is always concerning, but especially as some Indigenous knowledge and collections are not meant to be open or meant to be accessed by everyone. Add to this that there's more researchers working with Indigenous peoples and data than ever before. And this extractive or reductive research paradigm can remain in place. And we are in this era of big and open data. So these mistakes, these omissions that do exist are replicated into the digital lives of material. So a crucial step for Indigenous people having sovereignty over their data and collections is the necessary reckoning with these systems to move Indigenous peoples from often unnamed subjects to be contributors, authors, stewards of these materials. And part of that shift begins when Indigenous people are not only recognized, but are able to affect change within these spaces as authorities and as knowledge holders. So local contexts created a tool to support Indigenous people to reinsert their cultural authority and sovereignty into these spaces with the labels. So there are traditional knowledge and biocultural labels, and we'll talk both of them. And communities can use them to clearly state the provenance, protocols, and permissions of materials. So these are our labels. On the left are the TK or traditional knowledge labels. On the right are the biocultural or BC labels. These are all available on our website, but we're just showing the icons here. And so these can be used to express local and specific conditions for sharing, as well as how research and relationships can be pursued. And these are in alignment with existing community rules, governance, and protocols. So the labels here are educational, they're extra legal, meaning they are not legal. They're not a license per se. Again, intellectual property does not necessarily work in a way that supports Indigenous rights. So these are kind of working outside of that system. And so they were developed to be used on digital heritage, but we have seen some really innovative uses by communities that have taken them into physical spaces as well. So the goal of the labels is really to support that basic acknowledgement and attribution for communities, but it's also about moving towards Indigenous authorship and access, and further beyond to Indigenous authority and autonomy, as well as institutional accountability. So each of these labels has a different meaning, and the meanings are related to provenance, which is about where something comes from or who is responsible for it, protocols, how materials should be accessed, and permissions for how materials should be used into the future. So the labels have been developed over the past decade out of community partnerships. Communities have shared what needs they have in safeguarding their cultural and intellectual belongings. And so particular labels have been created to support those needs. So the traditional knowledge labels are specifically to support the inclusion of local protocols for access and use on cultural heritage. And there are 20 of them that we see here. The biocultural or BC labels are really specifically for biocultural collections and data. So this is related to the enormous amount of data that's being collected and generated from Indigenous lands and waters. And so these labels are about supporting Indigenous people's right to decide how that data, how those collections, those samples can be used. And there's 10 of those. So just wanted to take a look at what these labels actually look like. And these are one from each of the 3 categories. We won't have time to go into each of the labels today, but they are available on our website if you're interested, and would encourage you to read through them. So first, provenance label at the top. This is the TK of traditional knowledge, multiple communities. So a community would be using this label if there's multiple communities that have responsibility of custodianship or ownership over specific material. Next is a protocol label in the middle, and this is the TK seasonal label. And this label is really about connecting knowledge and land. A community would use this label if there's certain seasonal associations with materials. So for instance, certain songs or stories that are only meant to be told at a particular time of year. Finally, at the bottom is a permission label, and this is the TK non-commercial. So a community can use this label if they would like the material to only be used for non-commercial purposes. There's a TK and a BC version of this label. There's also the open to commercialization label, so that both options are possible, whether the community is interested in potential commercialization or not. So every community has the opportunity to create their own set of labels that will be theirs. Each of the labels comes with template text, which is what we were looking at in the previous slide. But to further support sovereignty, communities have the option to, what we say, customize their labels. So we're here looking at a TK attribution label. This label is about naming, putting proper attribution back into records. So just looking at the three parts of the label that we see here, there's the icon on the left. This is always going to be the same in every use of the label. And this is so we have one set of iconography that can be recognized across these many different contexts where we see the labels being used. On the right, we have the title and the description. So there are, again, template text as well as template titles for each label. And so in addition to the standard title, the community can provide their own name for the label, which is often a translation into their own language. The description here, so communities can use this template text, or they can write their own text to accompany the label, maybe to talk more specifically about what this label means to them. They might also write that in their own language as well. And so this customization is about adding, is an expression of sovereignty. It's about adding specificity and local conditions and meanings around the idea of the label. And we'll take a look at a community's customized label so you can see what we mean. So we're looking here at a screenshot. This is from the Scowlet's First Nation website. They are from what is today known as British Columbia. You can see in the top right corner here, there's 4 label icons, and clicking on any of those label icons will show the full text. So this is for the purposes of comparison. On the left is the Scowlet's attribution label, and on the right is the template attribution label. So I'll just give you a second to compare the two. So as you might be noticing, the Scowlets have titled their label in their language, Holcomb. The label text also talks more specifically about what the label means to them. And for them, it's about telling their story in their own words. So by using this label on their website, the Scowlets are labeling the information and stories shared here as their true knowledge and history. And they're also asking viewers to use this in a respectful way. I want to talk about one more set of labels that are being used, and then I'll pass it over to James. So this is one of our favorite examples. You might have heard of it before, be familiar with it. There's a really great short film available on our website that we always recommend watching, just to hear about this work in the Passamaquoddy's own words. But just to give a little bit of an overview, in 1890, there were recordings made of Passamaquoddy songs and stories in Maine. And as many of these collections do, these recordings then ended up far away from the community, first at Harvard and then donated to the Library of Congress. So the tribe first heard these recordings in the 1980s, but they could not really be understood at that time. The recordings were made on wax cylinders, but technology did improve in the 2010s so that the tribe was really able to hear the recordings for the first time then. So what we're looking at here is a screenshot from before the Library of Congress and Passamaquoddy worked together on this project. As you can see, the record is quite bare. There's not a lot of information here. So this is a screenshot from the updated record. And so after multiple years of collaboration, the tribe's elders listened to the recordings. They were actually able to determine what songs and stories were on the recordings, which was not known previously. And this information, along with a lot of cultural context, Passamaquoddy words, were added to the Library of Congress record, which we can see here. So there's much more than is pictured in this screenshot, but you can see even under the title, there are Passamaquoddy titles as well. And then there's the start of a summary that begins more cultural context of this record. But the tribe really felt comfortable doing this, sharing this information, because they were able to apply their TK labels, which you can see on the right. But let's look at what these actually mean. So these are the 3 labels that the tribe decided to apply on the records. So it's the attribution label. So the Passamaquoddy are asked to be attributed in all this material wherever it is used or referenced. The outreach label, so they have shared this information because it is educational, it's meant to be shared. They're doing so to raise greater awareness and respect for Passamaquoddy culture. And then they have also applied the non-commercial, meaning that they would not like this material to be used in any commercial purposes. So we have a short clip from one of our films made with the Penobscot that I'm gonna play, and then we'll hand it over to James. Let me know if you can hear the sound.
We can hear it. Thank you, Corey.
We had an elder in our community. His name is Charles Norman Shea. And he was cleaning out his old family house, and he was in the garage, and he found this old photograph of his mother when she was probably 18 or 19 years old. I realized that she had a collar on, like a traditional ceremonial collar. That's a very important piece of regalia for our community.
There were a lot of really elaborate and beautiful collars. And they're symbolic, you know, it's the weight of responsibility on their shoulders.
Not only did I realize that she had this collar on, I recognized the collar. And it was a collar that was held by the Smithsonian.
When I go to a museum, I am elated and happy and excited. And then I'm also like really, really sad and devastated at the same time. You know, museums and tribes, it's such a loaded thing, and it's so, it's not black and white, and it's not easy. They're housing them, but they belong to us, and they always will, no matter who owns them.
This collar was actually purchased from a woman named Ada Sakabasin. And Charles was like, oh, that's our next door neighbor. Ada had sold it to what are called commercial ethnographers, a company called Covert and Harrington. Covert and Harrington would go around to these communities at a time when it was believed that we were going to become extinct and buy up a lot of cultural heritage items for pennies on the dollar. That's the kind of path that this collar took from Ada Sakabasin to Covert and Harrington on behalf of George Hay, and became part of the collection of the National Museum of American Indian, the Smithsonian.
It's so much more than an object to us, you know, it's our culture, and the thing is, we didn't disappear. we're still here.
Charles, as soon as he found out, well, I want it back. And I says, well, that's a little more difficult than just you wanting it back.
It was sold and it was a legal transaction, and that's that. So the next best thing is, let's just make it. Let's just recreate it and bring it back that way.
He had the means to actually hire artists within the community to travel to DC to study the collar and then to recreate that collar for him.
Every drawer that I pulled out, I was just like, oh my gosh, you know, just like amazed at what they had. It was really inspiring, and it was really sad at the same time. Like the dance rattles, like I would dream about them after. I just wanted to pick it up and like sing a song with it. It felt like it was lonely, like those things, you know, they have their own life and their own power. And so to be there with them was like really moving, and just like a ton of different emotions. This will be the hardest thing I've ever made, by far. It's a big, big project, but I was really happy and excited to do it. And if I can make something kind of reappear in our community, then I think that's a really good thing.
When she finished the collar, we had a press conference, and she opened the box, and it was just, it radiated. It was so beautiful and new. The only thing that was more amazing was when she put it on him. A wave of energy went through the room and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up.
It still makes me cry to talk about it. Even though that wasn't the collar from the early 1800s and it wasn't the one, it was almost like the power of that collar came home, and the energy of that came home with us.
And I realized in that moment that out of all the collars that I had seen, I had never seen anybody have one put on their body. And it was just an amazing moment in the history of our tribe. It really synthesized like a path for me. You know, the history of the extraction of our cultural heritage items from our community to someplace else has happened. How do we move forward is the tact I need to take. It's my job to help others share our collective history. Our main goal today is to get digital items of absolutely everything. All Penobscot items that are in institutions across this country and around the world need to come home, at least digitally, so we can put them in front of Penobscot people.
There's like a spiritual connection, but also like pride of who you are and how strong and how beautiful your ancestors are. And if you can't see that, it makes everything more difficult, I think.
Great. So that was just a short clip. Our full film is available on our website, but I'm going to pass it over to James to talk about his work.
Thank you, Corey. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
So, you know, when you start to think about, you know, what it really takes to do this type of work, there's a lot of heavy lifting on a couple of fronts. You know, the institutions, you know, need to, you know, do this work, but also there's a lot of things that need to be done at the community level. And we realized early on that there was a big problem in the Penobscot Nation, and it really came to a head in the late 1990s with this this woman who was working in our language program with Dr. Frank Siebert. There were three people there. There was a person who became our language master and worked with the tribe. She was a tribal member. There was a non-tribal member woman, and then a non-tribal member, Dr. Siebert. And he wasn't a linguist at all, but he was a pathologist, actually, who retired to come and record our language and give us a written alphabet. But the non-Indigenous, the non-Penobscot woman at the time took advantage of the tribe and used her time and the resources at her fingertips to get her PhD at the local university. And the tribal council became quite upset when they heard about this. So go ahead, Corey. So a group of people within the tribe, they created what was called the Penobscot Heritage Preservation and Protection Committee. And they developed rules for research, publications, recording, and other media, and developed policies, procedures, and a project request form. And they said that the Penobscot people have promulgated and passed these rules to protect their rights to privacy and to the Penobscot intellectual resources due to continued abuse, misrepresentation, and exploitation to our rights of our people. It is necessary that these guidelines be established and strictly followed. So this committee was they were busy and they were largely busy saying no to everything. And it was any project that came across their purview was turned down, including the republication of a book that a tribal member wanted to republish, and they promptly stopped him from doing that. Go ahead, Corey. So it kind of lost a lot of credibility, and when in the fall of 2002, the Cultural and Historic Preservation Department was being built. I was the chair of the Cultural and Historic Preservation Committee, kind of in charge of what our culture department would look like. And we took over the research review duties from that entity. And we had some successes. We co-published a book called Wabanaki Homeland in the New State of Maine. We had some woman who was dressing up like Molly Spotted Elk. You can see the picture in the lower corner. She was an actress or wannabe actress, and she was performing as Molly Spotted Elk and trying to sell her content to schools districts in Maine to satisfy the new law that said all schools have to teach Native American history and culture as part of the curriculum. And I was getting a lot of phone calls from women in my community quite upset about this, because Molly Spotted Elk's 1920 vaudeville type style act was very risque and doesn't really reflect who we are as a people at all. And so in the end, we did succeed in stopping her from performing those. And the book that wanted to get published by a tribal member actually fell into public domain at some point. In 1993, probably. It was published in 1893. The Life and Traditions of the Red Man, and it was published by Annette Cologne. And a family member, the grandson of the author, stepped in and wanted it to get republished. So we worked with them and then honored the family within the community and got that republished. Go ahead, Corey. So while we were doing this type of work, we were busy writing grants for curriculum and writing grants for language also. And we wrote a grant that we wanted to digitize all of our language. And about the 11th hour before submitting said grant, which was quite robust and quite taxing to do, we find out that the University of Maine, along with the American Philosophical Society, who holds our language materials that Dr. Siebert's daughters put in there, applied for an NSF grant to do exactly the same thing with our language that we were purporting to do. And because they had already submitted and they were just waiting to find out, it put our federally funded grant in jeopardy. Go ahead, Corey. And the person at the University of Maine who submitted that grant was the same woman that got her PhD working with the tribe. And so very, very problematic. And so we were working on, Dr. Barney Newsom is in the middle. And when she was getting her PhD, she's a Penobscot woman. She was the original director of the Cultural and Historic Preservation Department. We've worked together for many, many years. And when she was going through to get her PhD, she worked on an iPinch project, which is intellectual property and cultural heritage, a program through Simon Fraser University. And she was looking at these issues around resource protection and intellectual property rights and how to manage mostly archaeological requests also. And so she needed a committee, and I had built a committee I got people from every department within the tribal government to serve on kind of an exploration committee to deal with, these rights and resource protection things. And so we developed the Penobscot Tribal Rights and Resource Protection Board. There is, I think there's 10 or 11 of us currently. And we convene and we review projects, and we also kind of identify what is the intellectual property of the Penobscot Nation, what we feel is important enough. Corey, if you could advance this. The original intent was to create what's called an IRB, to protect human subjects from research. But we found out rather quickly that, with cultural misappropriation, we also felt that we needed a little more teeth that goes beyond an IRB. And so our board includes three sections, three committees. The IRB, which we're working with the University of Maine right now to develop that. We also have an intellectual property committee. This committee is our MOU generator and also really works to identify what components of Penobscot culture we want to preserve. And then the education committee. We want Penobscot tribal members to be educated about that we have this board, what we do, but also institutions like, Colby, Bowdoin, and Bates, to know that we have a process for people doing research on our community. And so it's a pretty hefty workload for the 11 of us who do work on this. And it's not easy. It's a lot of reading. Sometimes you receive something from authors and they're pretty wedded to it and they don't want to hear what you have to say. So sometimes it's an uphill battle. And so we as a committee just have to press on. Go ahead, Corey. But this is a really important component because the 11 of us really worked to, with local context early on to, develop our traditional knowledge labels. And because we had just come out of, the problem with the the language grant, which we had to write a new grant, and it dovetailed with theirs. And then they didn't get funding because of all things. They didn't have any collaboration with the community whose language you were working with. And so then I had to advocate for them to get funding later because we needed them to do certain things that we dovetailed with. It was just a big mess. And so we started working with local context and the traditional knowledge labels and the Abbey Museum. We did training with all the Wabanaki communities around this, so they are well aware of the labels and have done some work to Passamaquoddies have developed their labels. The Maliseets and the Micmacs don't have the robust staff that some Penobscots and Passamaquoddies do, so it's a heavier lift for them. And so it's a thing that we continue to do. And so when we developed our labels, go ahead, Corey, we found that that two things weren't there for us. One, we had this language issue. We wanted to protect those language materials that were housed at the American Philosophical Society. We wanted to be alerted that University of Maines of the world were, wanting to digitize our language. Who's going to speak those words? You know, and so there was no label within the suite of the TK labels that really addressed what we wanted to do. And so we talked to Dr. Jane Anderson about it, and she was like, oh, well, just make one. It's many of these labels came out of the need of the communities that wanted to work with the labels, but something didn't quite fit. And so we developed a culturally sensitive label. There is one that is called Secret Sacred, but that's really, defines kind of a, human remains and a NAGPRA-esque type of situation. And so we didn't want to go there because this was quite different. This is our language. And so we did end up getting that big grant, and we got it because we were the first tribe in the United States to apply to this specific language grant to protect our language as intellectual property. So it was a big, big win. And developing the labels was just the next logical step in that. And then we had community voice. One of the things, as I was saying in the video, was that we want all of this stuff to come home from these institutions and put it in front of Penobscot people. And even if it's just digitally. And then we use a platform called Mukatu, which is a content management system, and to put that in front of just Penobscot people. And we are trying to elicit stories from them. We want to hear what their grandmother would say about those baskets. We want to hear what those family stories are about that particular person in that picture. And we felt that, one, by only having it open to Penobscot tribal members, we get more stories. But also we wanted to develop this label to elicit stories from the community. It is time for us to share our histories. It's time to really question some of the tomes that have been written about us in the historic record at a time when Native people had to be dehumanized to justify the taking of the land. It's time for us to start asserting our voices in our own stories. So that's just a little kind of introduction. One of the things that's really important to realize as institutions start to work with these communities is one, there needs to, from our point of view, please be patient. We're working with a lot of different institutions. There are only 11 of us, and we've been appointed by our tribal council to represent the Penobscot Nation on these matters. but also digitize. Because for us, it's getting this stuff digitized and getting both those digital copies and the metadata is really important for us to be able to. We have to look at this stuff before we can put a label on it, and we're the ones who have to assign the labels. It's our voice in the institutions that we're working with. And so, and it's not just my voice, it's not just Jennifer's voice, it's those 11 people that have been appointed to be that voice. So, yeah, be patient and digitize. Thank you all for your time, and I'm going to swing it back to Corey.
Yeah, thanks, James. So I'm just going to give an overview of the notices, and then maybe we'll pause for questions. I probably won't have time to go through all of our examples, but can talk about that more at length, just because there's so much interesting things to say. But just to briefly talk about the notices. So the labels that we've been talking about so far, those are to be used and assigned by Indigenous communities. But we at Local Context, we believe that institutions and researchers have a part to play in this work and have a responsibility to disclose Indigenous collections and data. And so to help with that, we created the notices. So this is just an overview of our different notices. We have categories for them like we do for the labels as well. So Local Context really did start with the labels, but the notices have been developed to support institutions and researchers to make visible Indigenous data and collections, to help communities find their knowledge, their belongings, their ancestors, so that they can then be part of the decision-making around their access and use. So the notices are really about dispersing some of the labor that, as we've been talking about, is involved in this work, to at least start to identify this material. And so the notices, like the labels, are digital tags. And the three categories here are engagement, disclosure, and collections care. So the engagement notice is often where we'll see institutions and researchers start, really just as it kind of says, saying that they're open to collaborate. The disclosure notices are more for identifying and sharing where there are Indigenous collections. And then the collections care notices are a new set developed this year with the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. And these are really for physical collection storage to actually be printed where there's certain cultural care that is needed for materials that are being stewarded outside of community contexts. So I think I'll maybe just talk about the Maine State Archives, because we're so excited about the use of the notices. This, as Kate mentioned, it is the first state archive that is involved with Local Context. And so they're using here the Open to Collaborate notice. So it's used on a few different places, but it's really making clear that they're open and committed to collaborating. And again, this is alongside work with Wabanaki Nations. So it's really fantastic, and it's a really great place to start. So we do like to showcase it. There is other work going on in Maine, like at the Abbey Museum, as Jane mentioned. They're using the notices. But I think I'll leave it there for now. And just share how you can keep in touch with us. We have a website with a lot of information. You can reach out to us at this email. We have several networks, and some are based around kind of communities of practice. So the Cultural Institution Working Group would be fantastic for any of you to join. We also have regional groups, and given the amazing work that's already going on in Maine, I think we'd like to see maybe a more formal one start to take place. So I'll just leave you all with that thought, and we'll open it up for questions. And thanks again so much for having us.
Thank you so much, Corey. This was wonderful. And thank you too to James. Really some great information, I think. So I would like to open it up. If anyone has any questions, any comments. I think there's a few people here, like Julia, I'm going to kind of pick on you, who have some experience already with Local Context and would like to share that. So feel free to unmute yourself. Luckily, we're not too large of a group. So if you want to go ahead and unmute, and if you have a question, just go ahead and shout it out. All right. If you guys don't ask a question, I'm going to ask you questions. Julia, I'm going to pick on you first. Can you share a little bit about your experience in your first interactions with local contexts and sort of getting involved?
Sure. So I started learning about local contexts and their work when I was still at the Abbey Museum, prior to right now. And through ATOM, through going to the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museum conferences and seeing presentations, and then seeing how engaged Wabanaki communities were, especially Penobscot and Passamaquoddy, were doing work with them. At the time, the Abbey had started the process of getting our Past Perfect database online, and I stopped it pretty quickly after starting it because I realized that I probably didn't know as much as I thought I knew, and had heard about a related Mukatu, which is kind of a related cousin of a cousin in the realm of the work that TK Labels and local context does, and a lot of the thoughts that hadn't occurred to me in terms of sharing Indigenous cultural heritage online. And so started to learn about Mukatu, started to learn about the labels, and started the project that James mentioned, working with the Wabanaki nations to do training for the communities on how to start doing their own TK labels, how to do the definitions and so on. That project had not been completed by the time I left the Abbey, so it's been through a few hands since then. But it was really exciting to see opportunities developing for us to do better as collecting institutions with what we were stewarding, and that it's a really important, seen as a really important complement to work like repatriation, because so yeah, I think that I'll leave it there.
I think that's awesome. Thank you. I'm wondering how many of you here have Indigenous collections that you're just not really sure how to approach and how to share and how to handle those. Anyone want to kind of do their virtual raised hand? Do you have Indigenous collections that you're caring for? I'm going to raise my hand. Julia, definitely. I happen to know a few of you do as well, because I know some of your collections. This is the hazard of Maine, and we're so small and we all know each other's collections. And I'm just wondering if there's any specific questions about, say, you have a basket, you're wondering what's the best way to share that, to reach out to communities and get their input. Aaron?
Hi. Yeah. So I'm at the Abbey now, and I have a question related to what you just asked, but I don't know if anyone could speak to. I know there's some movement thinking about contemporary art from Native artists and kind of future cultural patrimony, and I know there are conversations happening about, thinking about contemporary works that are purchased by museums, but ensuring that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, we're not having similar conversations. I don't know if anyone would be able to speak to that a little bit.
I love that question. James or Corey, are these conversations that you're having?
It's not a conversation that I have heard be brought up. I know in particular at the Abbey, there was some artwork that was bought that or obtained. I'm not sure how the Abbey got it, but some people wanted it back after that person had passed away or something. I recollect something going on there at one point. But I think it's really important that institutions start to think about these things as you're working with Indigenous communities, because our biggest tool is the relationship that we have. And as we build those relationships between the researchers or the institutions and the communities, we really have to get those relationships to survive our tenures at those spots. I'm not going to be where I am forever, but using MOUs between the communities and the institutions really can outline what each really wants and where each is coming from as they approach this. And so we put together a groundbreaking MOU with the University of Maine, and that was actually a product of the grant that they tried to, the grant they submitted. We felt that we needed to protect our cultural heritage items that were housed at the University of Maine, and we did that. And it was it's very clear now what the University of Maine will and won't do with our cultural heritage items. And thank you, Corey. Corey just put a link to that on there. And it's scalable. We're talking about an amendment to that to further protect what's going on there today. And so it's it's real important that as we build these relationships, like the Abbey, we have an excellent relationship with the Abbey Museum. I've known Julia forever. And now that's bled over to another institution. But Gretchen Faulkner at the Hudson Museum has implemented a system for years that we really liked. And so we solidified that system within the MOU so that when Gretchen ever retires, we will still have that same system in place, and still the tribes will still be called when somebody wants access to their cultural heritage items. And so it's that MOU is so important to those relationships, because we're working outside of an arena that is outside of the law. I mean, it's cultural and communities don't fit into intellectual property law very well. And so local context has provided these tools and some trainings to help us get to a place where we can start asserting our voice in these institutions that is outside of that legal framework.
Excellent. Thank you, James. Are there any last questions? I just really want to thank you all for attending. A huge thank you to both Corey and James for this excellent presentation. And I hope that what this program has done is at least given you an opportunity to stop and think about the cultural heritage collections that you may care for, that your institution may hold, and what other voices really are needed to help share those fully and to make them fully accessible, and to make them as meaningful as possible to the communities who created them, and to let us all learn from them. So thank you all so much. I'll be sure to share this recording with everyone who's registered. And of course, as there's more questions, feel free to reach out to me, to Corey, to James. We will help. So thank you all, and you have a wonderful, wonderful day. All right, bye.